Okay, hello everybody. This is live from Michigan State University down here. I wanted to start with 52.4. What we're going to do on the biomes is I'm going to hit the biomes in class. We're going to talk about the different parts that we have to worry about in the biomes. But I want to do interactions between organisms and the environment and dispersal of how organisms are across a given area. Like how do they live between areas? Do they all live clumped together? And you can look at distribution globally, and you can look at also at a smaller range. So we have some of these same terms that we've talked about before with adaptive radiation. So first of all, they gave a couple of examples of how natural selection sometimes has an influence on dispersal, and also, for example, long distance dispersal can lead to adaptive radiation and change over time. And they gave us the examples of the cattle egrets and also the Hawaiian silver swords. And those two are fine and dandy. I want to look kind of at the kangaroos. I kind of look at, but here, for example, they can actually map the areas. And so your question would be, in the time, how come this has moved from these? This is kind of interesting, from this area in 1937, eventually to up in this area. And so the question would be, what environmental factors have caused the organism, that cattle egret, to actually go more north than anything? It's kind of interesting. They were able to cross the Atlantic Ocean. They were able to cross into South America, gradually spreading southward, northward through Central America. It's just an extreme. So from 1877 all the way to that, and understanding why they've moved. Sometimes they can transplant accidentally. I always think of about that with plants, for example. Excuse me. But the transplant, in order to be dispersed and the transplant to be successful, they have to not just live there but reproduce in that area, really establish themselves in that area. Okay, and some organisms are distributed. They don't occupy all of the range, and they may be limited by their behavior, which is kind of cool. So they talked about it might be predatory, where you're hiding. It might be resources that you're eating. It might be competition. For example, there was a sea urchin experiment that they talked about, which is kind of interesting. I like the pictures that it talked about. Later on, actually, in the next chapter, it talked about how they're dispersed. Are they clumped? Do they live together? This was interesting. A very, very simple experiment where they wanted to see the effects of this seaweed, which is a biotic factor, and does it limit seaweed distribution? And so they tested the sea urchin and the limpet, and actually found that the sea urchin, when the sea urchin was pulled and measured the seaweed, and then they pulled the limpet out and measured the seaweed, and they pulled both of them out and realized that it definitely affected the seaweed, but they noticed that the urchins have more of an effect on the seaweed population than the limpet does, which is kind of interesting. And abiotic factors are those that are not living: temperature, water, sunlight, wind, rocks, and soil, which is more of a habitat thing. Sunlight, no, so the amount of sun, they can vary. So temperature, obviously, we'll talk about temperature in each of the biomes, but that can make that can force certain animals to migrate and to burrow differently and put away food, because food is affected by temperature. Water and oxygen, obviously, in those areas with water makes a huge difference. The concentrations, salt concentration. It was interesting, especially in those areas like an estuary where fresh water and salt water intermix. They have to be able to withstand varying amounts of salinity. That was the experiment we did in college with crayfish, and we measured what was their salt tolerance. So we exposed them to different salt to see, because we know that down in the bayous, down there, Louisiana area, that there's lots of estuaries where salt water infiltrates some of the fresh water, and organisms certainly live there. Light intensity can be affected by latitude, of course. It can be affected the higher that you go in elevation, the less filtering that happens. So you can have it more intense. Coloration of the organism, the time during the rotation around the sun can make a difference. all of those different things. And so animals have different behavior to accommodate to the sunlight. And rocks and soils also vary in pH and in concentration. They may eat them, but they also might change and give off, like if it was more of a limestone, it can be affected by acid rain and give off any sort of liquid, but also homes and different things like that. A lot of organisms live off certain mineral compositions. So it's interesting on that. So this is kind of interesting. Why does species X absent from an area? And you have to think about what is it that contributes to that, or why does an organism live in a certain place? Why and what is affecting that? Okay. So I want to go to 53. I thought this was interesting. Started talking about counting sheep, which is interesting. And this is population ecology. So in this chapter, they talk a lot about dispersal, and there is some more math involved here in some of these examples. They kind of go into a little bit more detail than what we necessarily want to go into, but we definitely want to talk about carrying capacity and stuff like that. So they were talking about how do you study a group of organisms, and how do you count these organisms, and there was and literally counting sheep, not the ones that jump across, for example. Okay, so with the sheep here, counting sheep, what they were looking at is this group of sheep. They captured the sheep in 1932 on this island, which is geographically isolated, and they were actually able to study this isolated population and found kind of interesting that the population almost swung by 50% each year depending on predation and also food effects. So the question is, with all of these organisms, what affects this population? Is it abiotic, biotic factors, a predator, and then what keeps it in check, or what makes it to a point where an animal then would become extinct or become endangered or something like that? What is it about that? So that's the population ecology that we study, the density and distribution. There's the definition of population. Density, the number of individuals. Dispersion is the pattern. A lot of times what they do is a mark recapture method, which is very interesting when you think about most of the time they can mark and recapture an organism without hurting it. For example, they gave a couple examples of the research method of taking pictures of dolphins. And this is kind of interesting, this formula here. And so the dolphins, they have distinct fins here, and they were actually able to take pictures. So they capture and release a group of individuals, they mark them, and then they go and capture a second group of animals and take into account the number that are already marked there, and they actually come up with like a ratio. And let me see if let me go back. So part of Hector's dolphins. So what they got is, when they first captured a group of organisms, they had 180 organisms, or they had 180 organisms, and then they captured a group of organisms. They captured 44 organisms, and of those 44 organisms in the second sampling, 7 of those organisms were already counted, and so they were able to set up a ratio where you could calculate how many organisms they believe are in the group. Okay, so they were actually able to measure. The only part is that during that, they assume that there's really no immigration or emigration at that time, but we know that that does affect it. So you've got births, of course, that happen, and death, and then those moving into a population, those moving out of a population. So all of those influence the dispersal or the density of a population. And then also that group of population and where they live is also interesting. So they were showing clumped versus uniform or random distribution. I love the uniform distribution with all of those penguins. Here's a great clumped group of starfish, of course. This is an intertidal pool. Very interesting. You can have some of those distribution dispersion can be because of territorial, which we know a lot of organisms mark their territory. Here's your penguins, which I think those are emperor penguins, and their nesting patterns, kind of where they're located. Interesting. So it says they have a uniform space maintained by aggressive interaction. You wouldn't think penguins would be very aggressive, for example, but kind of interesting there. I wonder if this will work. I don't think it's going to. And random, I kind of think about like the dandelions in your yard. So demography is the study of the vital statistics of a population, how they change. This is where we're going to get into some math in here. So they have death rates and birth rates, and they have a life table. I was kind of thinking about Sarah Whale. She's an actuary. She actually figures out life insurance and risk values, very mathy. And they take a group of individuals. So we have the Belding ground squirrels, which I believe are the squirrels we talked about, give the warning cry. And they have the life table on page 1173, and they show they're actually able to map out here. You can see where the males usually only have a lifespan about 5 to 6 years. Kind of interesting, where maybe it's a protection thing, maybe it's fighting, maybe, I don't know. That's kind of interesting. You can also look at what is the death rate. You know, this is number of lives starting and the number of deaths during the year and how they go down and how very few actually live out to 9 to 10 years down the road. And then you can create a survivorship curve. And you can see, and then start looking at why you might have, for example, why does it plateau off here? How come this goes down here at this rate? Because look, already at this, you can see the slope at which the males decrease as far as survivorship curve. Type 1, Type 2, and Type 3. So Type 1 is low death rates during the early middle life, but an increased death rate as you go. A constant death rate over the lifespan, are high death rates for young, which this is one of the things they talked about, how organisms spend a lot more time with their young to help them survive. So when you get a lot of offspring, the death rate tends to be quite high when you get clutches that are very, very high. Whereas then with humans, we put all our you know, our energy into one organism to make that survive. Kind of interesting. So look at this. You know, I have as we go the number of survivor, and then it drops off, which is kind of interesting. So we've done a really good job in healthcare keeping those little tiny babies alive, and as the body gets older and older, then it drops off, and that makes this is interesting. So once you make it here and make it to an established what is this? This is of a type of oyster. Once you've made it here, then you kind of survive. There's nothing. You're going to go a number of individuals surviving to 100. And it looks like you get maybe one, but they kind of slope off here. Kind of interesting. You can also have a reproductive table, and I think this is interesting, where it shows those ground squirrels and when they reproduce. So right away, you can see that between 0 to 1, ground squirrels are not fertile. That is not necessarily the case of all organisms. I believe it's not very long, within the first month, mice are ready to reproduce. But a lot of organisms, it takes a little while. I mean, with us, think about it, the average age is getting younger. It is shifting, but even 12-year-olds can have babies now. Of course, let me clarify. You can be 12 and have a baby. I wouldn't suggest it because you don't have the resources to actually keep that baby. You might not have the resources to keep that baby alive, which is what we need, you know, and raise that child. Okay, this has got a whole bunch of different exponential models which are on the AP exam, and they are on the formula sheet with exponential population growth and exponential growth. So we're going to go through these, but you have to take into account your change of population. It has to deal with your births, who comes into the population, who dies, and who leaves. So this makes sense that you should add, and these are your minuses, and then that should be your population change. And your population growth can be expressed as the change in and the population divided by over time is your births minus your deaths. And your birth and death rate can be expressed as the number of births per individual during the specified time interval, where little b is the annual per capita birth rate and m is mortality. They actually go through and they define these also in the AP formula sheet. So we can revise that. Our change in population divided by the change in time is your birth, so B, your birth rate over time, and your mortality rate over time, so your BN and your MN again. So this would be saying again, population is the time using per capita birth and death rates rather than the number of births and deaths. So we're using a rate, which makes more sense than just a given number. The per capita rate of increase is given by R is equal to B minus N, which is the difference per capita of both of those. That's an R, and we see R a lot. And then we're going to change R right now into into using this in several equations now, and we're going to kind of do some curves, a little touch into a little calculus, but not bad. When the birth and death rate actually equal one another, of course, we get 0. Okay, so we have the change in population over a time period is equal to R, which is your birth rates minus mortality rate, which is your per capita, times your population. And we're going to use that because a lot of times scientists want to know like instantaneously. Now keep in mind also for this, there's usually a fixed time. This equation is for like given a year. And remember that it does not include immigration or emigration, just birth and death rates. And a lot of times scientists want to have a particular instantaneous per capita rate. So this is where they use a little bit of differential calculus, which you wouldn't necessarily, it is mentioned in here, but we'll go over some problems that might encounter this stuff. But it's more the interpretation of kind of what this is. So most of the time, experimental population growth, which the equation is also labeled at your AP bio formulas, is known as R max under ideal conditions, where, you know, kind of like a Hardy-Weinberg thing, thinking about that. So what is the rate? And it forms an exponential curve like this, and you have to be able to look at, so this is number of generations. So obviously this curve goes up, and this curve is kind of out here. It takes a little while. So it was talking about, although the maximum rate of increase is constant, the population accumulates with more new individuals per unit of time when you have a large population rather than a small. So you get progressively steeper over time when it's a large population. And then with a smaller, again, will grow faster than one with a lower rate. So if you think about, again, change in population, let me go back, change in population over time is your maximum growth rate times your population. So again, an example, they have the J-shaped curve of the exponential growth characterizes some rebounding population. So the elephant population growing exponentially once hunting was banned. And so you have to look at what is that. Now most of the time, and this is also going back to that question that we had on bacteria, where you had bacteria and then you introduced a virus. Part of explaining that bacteria growth is it's growing exponentially because it is in an environment that it has food, and then the virus was introduced, and then it killed off any bacterial or any bacteria that was not resistant to the virus was fine. Otherwise, it would have taken the population down to 0. But there was some that was resistant, so therefore it came back down. Now, the virus population also decreased after that because the viruses could not prey on those that were resistant to it. And so now you look at, there was a balance where it just went up and down, where you have viruses and you kill the organism, or you get inside of it and have lysis, but then you have to find other bacteria to support you. And so eventually you could almost kill off so many of your hosts that you're going to die. Well, part of that is called carrying capacity, and it's the amount that the population can support. People are talking about, of course, the carrying capacity of the world and how many people we can actually have on the world and actually support them. We still have lots of areas to live, but resources is huge too. I'm always baffled by hearing the populations in China and India compared to like our largest cities. It's just extreme, just extreme. So part of this is a logistic population growth model. And with the logistic model, you actually kind of have a different looking curve, but looking at that carry-in, how much do you go up and then how does it level off? So we have the same thing that we had before, except now you involve the carrying capacity minus the population all over the carrying capacity. So that's a huge part of what the environment can actually support. Okay, so you can see the math. You have the population size, the maximum rate of increase, and then the K minus NK, and it tells you what K is. And you can do the math and you end up with population growth rate, and you can kind of see how it is. Well, you can see the numbers going up, your population size, and then what's happening to this area, which is kind of interesting. And once you reach 1500, you're done. You can't support. So you end up with an S-shaped curve, which is kind of interesting. So here was our exponential growth that was not taken into account. This was just letting you grow and grow and grow, which we know resources are going to be limited and space is going to be limited, and predators usually increase as another organism, so we would hope predators would go up. But eventually, for example, if this is a rabbit population, eventually the wolves then start eating the rabbits and they come down. The wolves become plentiful, but then eventually they run out of food and then the wolves go back down. So the carrying capacity keeps everything kind of in adjustment. And it has to do with, of course, the amount of food that an organism needs and the space that it needs to live and other resources. So this is kind of interesting how it slows and then it levels off. Part of this was trying, like for China, saying how many children, was trying to do a population, trying to regulate the population. I mean, it makes sense. I mean, kinda. The more children you have, the more resources you need. People always say, well, if you wait to have children, or if you wait to have money, then you'll never have children, because people say, I want to support my child. That is true, though, because you have to support them with, if you just give them the basics of food and water, you still have to provide that in a house, and water and heat. And those are some of the things. For example, if you don't have those, then maybe Child Protective Services comes in if you can't provide your child with food and water, clean water and heat in a house, which is kind of a little scary when you go through tough times, which we've had like the last couple of winters. So the population growth of paramecium fits into, even bacteria eventually will run out of room, and they also start touching one another and then stop dividing. But again, you have competition and competitors and all kinds of stuff. So definitely a population. Here's what you could do on your graphing calculator. You could put all your scatter plots in and have it do a best fit line on your calculator, which I know you did in Algebra 2. Sometimes you overshoot the carrying capacity and then come back down. So sometimes it goes above it and then comes back down, which is fine. Like this one, you overshoot and then come back down, which happens. And it fluctuates greatly. Sometimes they show an elite effect, having more difficult time surviving or reproducing if the population is too small, which is kind of interesting. Remember, though, if you have a small population, you may have fewer people to mate with, depending on your mating style. I like this model, and we talked about carrying capacity a lot in college because you have to think about the interactions of the environment, the abiotic and biotic factors that keep a population within the size. This is kind of interesting. A white rhino mother and calf talked to how it has a population of 10,000. The northern species, though, is critically endangered with a population of fewer than 15. And you ask yourself, well, why? Why is that? Why are there two? Is it because there's so few? Is it because of their gestational period? It takes a little bit longer and they're being killed. So you start making some hypotheses about what kind of things could have happened. Is it more in an area where there's hunting or conservation, or what's actually making these organisms become less in population? And then looking at, the last part is looking at life history. Alright, an organism's life history is comprising all the traits that affect reproduction and survival, age at which you can reproduce, how often, and how many offspring you get, like what's your clutch. All kinds of different traits. Simulparity or Big Bang reproduction, once and die. Can you give me an example? Hopefully you tell me the lamprey, for example, or you could tell me the black widow or the praying mantis male, where they reproduce once and then die, or you have heteroparity or repeated, where you reproduce often, like rabbits reproducing often. So it really depends. You have to ask yourself why. Why would a lamprey get to be old enough and then die off, which I think is kind of interesting. Why is that? And they give some examples of the Big Bang, for example. And they give an example. Here's the agave. Has Big Bang, where the leaves of the plant are visible at the base of the flowery stalk, which is produced only at the end of the agave's life. Right here. Alright, I think we'll finish up pretty quick because I'm coughing like crazy. Trade-offs in life history. Trade-offs between survival and parental care. So that's huge, whether or not you survive or reproduce. And that would go back to what we were talking about with spending time raising your offspring, and also the kin selection, where do I help this person survive because of the relatedness. So this is a reduced broad size, this is a parent surviving the following winter, versus the female, where you have less normal size, and how they, so look at, you might have a larger clutch, but this is you surviving because it just takes so much time and effort. And some plants produce small seeds so that they grow and disperse them a little bit easier than larger seeds, because it takes more effort, which I thought was interesting with the Brazil nut tree on the right, with the seeds inside the pod, or the dandelions are very easy. It doesn't take much to get them to disperse, for example. It does take a lot to parent, and I think about it as a human, but as an organism, you have to protect those offspring because they contain your genetics, and so that takes a lot of effort with a trade-off. And some if you produce larger seeds, you have to store more energy. Might be better if you produce a whole bunch of little seeds. K selection and R selection is kind of, we mentioned these before a little bit, but density dependent selection. So sensitive to population density, so when it's really super crowded. Or R selection, or density independent selection, where you reproduce, or it maximizes reproduction when there's not many people around. Alright, and the last part of 53.5, regulate population growth, are density dependent, and then I think that, and then we have exponential growth, human population, real quick. So what environments stop a pollution or a population from growing infinitely? You can mention all of these things. How come they show? Would they be radical, or how are we able to tell what's going on? So density independent is birth rates and death rates do not change with population. So the population density might change, but yet your numbers aren't going to change. And I know this sounds weird, but like if you have 15 individuals, do you still have the same number as you do when you have 50. And density dependent is when your birth rates fall and your death rates rise with population density. And that can give rise to what's going on, what's making these things. So this is density independent death rate here, independent, and this is density dependent as it goes down. So this is regardless, it just stays the same with your birth rate and death rate. And a part of it is negative feedback. So density dependent birth rates and death rates are affected by competition, territory, disease, people preying on them. It could be environmental toxic waste, could be a number of things. It's a negative feedback that regulates the population growth. So as birth rates increase, death rates well, birth and death rates are an example of negative that regulates. So as one goes up, well, negative feedback would be as one goes up, so the opposite reaction would take place. Here's your population size as you're coming down. The percent of young sheep producing lambs is going down, for example, in your population size. Again, if this was independent, it would just stay straight across. Competition for resources, toxic waste due to us dumping stuff in, prey, those. Intrinsic factors, physiological. It could be a number of things. The intrinsic factors here, they talked about reproductive rates of white-footed mice in a field can drop even when food and shelter are abundant. It says, the drop in reproduction at high population is associated with aggressive interaction of hormonal changes and a delay in sexual maturation and depress the immune system. So it could be some other things that are totally unrelated to that, and of course territory. Great picture of a cheetah peeing on a tree. Huh. And we'll look at it again. And also disease, we know that. Population dynamics focuses on the complex interaction between those two things. There's lots of stability and function. Weather can make a difference. Climate can make a difference, like El Nino or La Nina. A harsh winter, we've had quite a few of those. Looking at the populations, I think that would be really cool. Part of DNR is to look at, how you look at the number of wolves over the number of years, and how they go up and down over time. And of course it cycles. Is this a cycle thing that happens, or is there something out of the ordinary? Okay. Some populations undergo that boom and bust cycle. The lynx population, for example. So you want to look over it at a long period of time with the snowshoe hare, which is what I mentioned before, from 18. Look at this, 1850 to 1925. That's really cool. I always think about the cycles with the water. I'll be down. With the water, with the Great Lakes going up and down, and how it cycles, and people start freaking out when we have less water or more water, but it's a natural cycle. So you want to look at, the hypothesis, the hare's population cycle follows the cycle of winter food, and if it's correct, the cycle should stop if the food supply increases. If additional food, then your population should increase, but it continued to cycle. So it didn't support. So let's look at the number of snowshoe hares. And I mean, it kind of followed the same, but except look at here. So this increased and this increased. I don't know. It kind of follows the predation pattern of the hare. The hare's population cycle is driven by pressure from other predators. So this data actually supported this hypothesis. The hare's population cycle is linked to sunspot cycles. Sunspot activity affects light quality, which in turn is the quality of the hare's food. So you might not even think about that supporting it. So it's kind of interesting. You want to ask why those cycles are moving, and what's the purpose behind it. It could be having to do with sunspots and sun output. This is kind of interesting with the experiment of amoebas can migrate and forage better than a group. For example, here's a slug. Metapopulation is a group of populations linked by immigration and emigration. And if you immigrate, combined a higher survival rate when you're in a stable environment. So this is kind of interesting with some butterflies of occupied patch versus unoccupied. We'll talk about this a little bit more. I think we'll stop here on the human population. Well, let's finish up. We'll do the human population. So no population can grow indefinitely in humans again. So in 1650 began to grow exponentially. So there's the plague and then go up from there. And again, the question is, so we've got better health, better sanitation, better health care. But people are having less children per family, I think, than way back when, like back in my dad's family. So this is looking at the annual percentage increase is coming down because people are having less children. And to maintain population stability, a regional human population can exist with zero population growth, where high birth rate minus high death rate, or low birth rate minus low death rate. And you can switch between the two. Again, healthcare of women having the children, also to the country's age structure with the number of individuals. They always talk about a country can be kind of ranked on how well it takes care of its very young and its very old. For example, this is kind of fascinating. Rapid growth in Afghanistan, human in the United States, and also in Italy, where there really isn't any growth or population. But look at this. This is kind of interesting how it goes from age 85. So the number of the percent of population, I kind of find this kind of fascinating between the different countries. So the annual growth rate was 2.6% in Afghanistan, 1.0% in the United States, and 0 in Italy. And infant mortality and life expectancy can be different even in certain countries depending on their quality of life, less industrialized versus industrialized. The better health care you have, the more likely that the young will survive and the old will survive at that. So global population, they're thinking about 7.8 to 10.8 by 2050, which is really interesting. Part of the problem that people are thinking, which is what we're going to get into the next couple chapters, of course, is the ecological footprint. Like, not just using up the resources, but what we're putting out in the environment as well. Is that going to change what the pollution that we're putting out, and is that going to affect our resources and what we're leaving on the earth? And this is the amount of energy that is measured out there. So the gigajoules per capita energy use, which is really extreme. And of course, the energy comes at a price, whether it is hydroelectric or fossil fuels, and a number of things. So I just want you to, through all of this stuff like carrying capacity, I want you to think about why a certain group of organisms react the way they do and through the environment. So thank you. Make sure to look over this stuff. We will discuss and go through a little bit more of the math area. Once again, you need to look over specifically, I think I'll give you some specific questions as you're watching this. So I definitely think I would look at number 1 on page 1192. I would like you to make sure under concept 53.6, the question, how are humans different from other species in the ability to choose a carrying capacity for their environment? I want you to look at that. And those questions are in the back of the book. So question 1 on the multiple choice, question 2 on the multiple choice, question 3, question 6 and 7 and question 9 and question 10, and those will be on a quiz on Monday towards the end of the, towards probably the end of the hour, so, or towards the beginning. We might just do the beginning of the hour. Okay, thank you.